May 1945. The war in Europe was over. At least, that's what the world believed. Across the smoking ruins of the Rhineland, American trucks rumbled through the rain, carrying their final human cargo, German prisoners of war. The men sat hollow-eyed in silence. But in one of the convoys, something unexpected stirred curiosity among the guards. These weren't men at all. They were women, German signal operators, nurses, clerks, and anti-aircraft auxiliaries. Faces pale from exhaustion, hands blistered from long marches, eyes still hard with discipline. They had served the Reich until its dying hour, and now they were prisoners of the United States Army. Their destination was a makeshift detention camp near Remagen, built from the remnants of an abandoned airfield. The fences were still new, the watchtower screwed, and the ground wet with the residue of spring rains. American engineers had erected rows of wooden huts in record time. Simple, functional, and designed for order. As the trucks arrived, the sound of boots striking mud filled the air. Guards shouted instructions in English. Translators repeated them in German. Behind the wire, floodlights flickered through the mist. For the young women stepping through the gates, Captivity felt surreal. Only weeks earlier, they had been uniformed and confident, recording enemy positions and coordinating anti-aircraft fire. They had believed in victory. Now, standing under American command, their entire world had inverted. Some wept quietly. Others stood stiff, refusing to show weakness. But what no one could have predicted, neither the guards nor their prisoners, was that, in time, these women would refuse to leave even when offered freedom. At first, the Americans treated it like any other POW situation. Registration, interrogation, rations. The women were housed separately from the men, assigned bunks, and given basic fatigues marked PW. The camp commander, a pragmatic lieutenant from Illinois, noted how different they were from the usual prisoners, disciplined, polite, and unervingly composed. They lined up for roll call with perfect precision, sang hymns softly at dusk, and thanked their guards for meals. Even in defeat, they behaved like soldiers. Outside the wire, Germany was dissolving into chaos. Entire cities were burned shells: Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden. Millions wandered the roads, searching for food or family. The women inside the camp knew none of that yet. To them, the war was still a suspended moment. Each morning they awoke to order: the whistle at dawn, the breakfast bell, the count at noon. There was comfort in structure, even if it came from the enemy. The Americans, used to defiance from captured soldiers, found this quiet discipline unsettling. One corporal wrote in his diary that they behave as though the Reich still exists. Only the flags have changed. When letters finally arrived from home, the illusion shattered. Reports of Soviet occupation, hunger, and reprisals flooded in. Many of the women's families were gone. Some towns no longer existed. For those from the east, the Red Army's advance meant unspeakable dangers. And then, one morning, everything changed. The war had officially ended. The German surrender was signed. Word spread through the camp like wind through grass. The guards smiled, relieved to see the end of duty. The women listened in silence. That afternoon, the camp commander gathered them in the courtyard. Rain fell lightly as he read the translated announcement. The war is over. You are free. You may return home. The words hung in the damp air like a promise that refused to land. No-one moved. The commander repeated himself. The interpreter shouted louder. But still silence. The women stared at him with expressions of fear, not joy. Finally, one of them, a Luftwaffe radio assistant barely 21, whispered, "Home is gone." Another muttered, "We cannot go back." Within minutes, the truth became clear. Not one of them wished to leave. The Americans were baffled. Freedom, after all, was supposed to be the reward. Yet here they stood, hundreds of women clinging to captivity. Word spread quickly through the Allied ranks. Psychologists and journalists came to observe. They found order where there should have been chaos. Gardens planted beside barracks. Choirs rehearsing at sunset. A bulletin board decorated with pencil sketches of villages that no longer existed. The women weren't grateful because of comfort alone. They were terrified of what waited outside. Letters from liberated zones told of famine, revenge killings, and Soviet raids. In some towns, former party members, male or female, were being beaten or executed. Rumors reached even these camps. Women accused of aiding the Nazi cause had their heads shaved and were paraded through the streets. For those who had worn uniforms, leaving meant exposure. Remaining behind the wire meant safety, anonymity, and routine. The lieutenant in command wrote a memo to headquarters. Prisoners are refusing release. They claim there is nothing to return to. His superiors dismissed it at first. Surely once the gates opened, they would leave. But when trucks arrived to escort them home, many simply refused to board. Some hid in the barracks. Others begged to stay as cooks, nurses, or cleaners. They offered to work without pay. The guards, torn between compassion and confusion, allowed them to linger temporarily to eye in the days that followed. The camp became something between a refuge and a ghost town. Guards lowered their rifles. Prisoners organized their own routines. They held small classes, sharing scraps of knowledge from before the war, English phrases, sewing lessons, even first aid. An American chaplain visiting the camp later wrote that they had turned imprisonment into a kind of community. But beneath the calm, the question persisted: why did they stay? Was it fear, guilt, or something deeper, an attachment to the only structure they had ever known? Many of these women had been raised under Hitler Youth training, taught that discipline was identity. The American camp, with its predictable rhythm, mirrored that sense of order. Behind barbed wire, they still had purpose. Beyond it lay chaos. When journalists from Stars and Stripes arrived, they photographed the scene with disbelief. The images would later circulate in Allied archives. Young German women smiling as they swept the yard, their fatigue jackets rolled neatly at the cuffs. The captions read, "Released prisoners who chose not to leave." For the outside world, it was a curiosity. For the women, it was survival. Weeks passed. The U.S. Army prepared to dismantle its temporary camps. Supplies were running low. Attention was shifting to the Pacific Theater. Yet at Remagen and dozens of other sites, the same phenomenon appeared: women pleading to remain under American supervision. Some even volunteered to assist in other camps, serving as translators or clerks. To the guards, they were model prisoners. To historians, they would become an enigma. One evening, as the sun sank behind the barbed wire, an American sergeant stood near the gate and watched them singing softly in German, a hymn about homecoming. But their voices trembled on the final verse. They were not singing about going home. They were singing about what they had lost. Freedom had come too late. Outside the wire lay a land of ruins and ghosts, a country crushed beneath its own ideology. Inside, there was food, order, and, perhaps most of all, a sense of belonging, even under foreign watch. And so, when the gates finally opened, the women did not rush forward. They stood still, watching the sunlight spill through the gaps in the fence, uncertain if liberation was a gift or another form of loss. To understand why they chose captivity over freedom, one must look deeper, not at the fences themselves, but at what they represented: the last fragile walls of identity in a world that had burned its certainties to ash. Beyond those gates waited the ruins of Germany. But within, something unexpected had taken root, a quiet paradox that would challenge every notion of victory and defeat. And that paradox was only beginning to reveal its secret. The secret was not defiance, it was disorientation. The women who stayed behind the wire in 1945 had been trained since adolescence to find comfort in obedience. They were products of a nation that had blurred the lines between duty and devotion, between belonging and submission. In Nazi Germany, order was not merely a system, it was a religion. When that structure collapsed, so did the architecture of their minds. The camps, with their whistles, schedules, and guarded perimeters, became the last recognizable world they understood. Inside those American fences, the discipline they had been raised on returned. Only now, it came without ideology. The daily roll calls, the assigned duties, the watchtowers. They offered rhythm to women whose inner lives had been shattered. Psychologists who studied them later noted that captivity had given them an emotional constant. Freedom, by contrast, was an abyss. To walk beyond those gates meant confronting hunger, vengeance, and a Germany that no longer resembled the one they had served. American officers did not expect such a response. To them, captivity was a punishment. To these women, it was structure. The camps themselves were feats of engineering, temporary but efficient. Built from surplus Bailey Bridge panels and prefabricated huts, They had running water, medical tents, and storage warehouses powered by portable diesel generators. Behind that logistical miracle stood the expertise of U.S. Army engineers and quartermaster logisticians who had spent years perfecting the art of movement, supply, and survival. Ironically, their precision made captivity bearable. Each camp operated like a small, self-contained city. Generators hummed through the night, illuminating the compounds with low yellow light. Kitchen units baked bread by the ton, while field refrigeration trucks ensured that meat stayed edible even in summer heat. To the prisoners, many from bombed-out cities where food had vanished, this felt almost utopian. The same enemy who had destroyed their homes was now feeding them with mechanical consistency. It was order without cruelty, authority without rage. That distinction began to change something deep within them. Diaries recovered decades later describe how the prisoners compared their captors to their former officers. The Americans were firm, but not brutal. Rules were enforced by schedule, not shouting. One entry read simply, "They rule through routine, not fear." For the first time, many of these women saw authority detached from ideology, a revelation both unsettling and strange. When reporters from the Allied press visited, they found something beyond curiosity. In Camp Aibling, near Munich, American commanders had permitted the women to organize their own work details. They ran laundries, kitchens, and medical wards. They created timetables and posted duty rosters in perfect handwriting. One photograph showed a row of German auxiliaries peeling potatoes under the open sky, laughing with the very soldiers who had captured them. The image, reprinted in American newspapers, fascinated readers, defeated enemies smiling under Allied care. But behind those smiles lay exhaustion and uncertainty. To understand the depth of their choice, one must imagine the Germany awaiting them. Cities reduced to skeletons of brick. Rail lines twisted into ribbons of steel. Entire neighborhoods silent, but for the wind blowing through hollowed windows. Food shortages were so dire that civilians survived on black bread and powdered turnip. The Reich that had once promised eternal victory was now a wasteland. For the women who had served it, shame and danger were everywhere. Some feared revenge from neighbors or the occupying Soviets. Others simply had nowhere to go, no family, no address, no nation that wanted them. In the safety of the American compounds, they found something resembling community. They began teaching each other languages, music, and sewing. They mended uniforms for soldiers and repaired typewriters used by camp clerks. Some volunteered in hospitals, tending wounded Allied troops. The irony was profound. Women who had once supported a machine of war were now sustaining the men who had destroyed it. Yet these acts were not treachery. They were survival through usefulness. American guards, many barely older than the prisoners, grew protective. They nicknamed some of the women Blondie or Hilda, shared cigarettes through the wire, and occasionally listened to them sing in the evenings. Letters home from GIs spoke of the polite German girls who never complained. To them, the camps had transformed from zones of hostility into quiet, surreal villages of waiting. Still, Washington wanted the camps emptied. By the summer of 1945, orders came from Allied command to repatriate all non-criminal POWs. Trucks arrived again, engines idling in the dust. Officers called names. Some women obeyed. Others hesitated at the gate, holding their meager belongings, a rolled blanket, a tin cup, and a bar of soap. Witnesses later recalled that some cried not from joy, but from dread. That a few begged to remain as workers. "Please, Major," one said, "I can't cook. I can clean." The interpreter repeated her plea. The officer looked at her, thin, pale, barely more than 20, and then quietly allowed her to stay. Her name was recorded on a list of temporary assistants. There were dozens like her. As weeks passed, the distinction between prisoner and laborer blurred. Former captives now wore armbands marked CW, civilian worker. They served in kitchens, typed reports, and assisted engineers in maintaining camp utilities. It was not freedom, yet it was not captivity either. It was a fragile middle ground where identity could still make sense. By autumn, most camps were finally closed. Those who remained were escorted gently to transport convoys leading toward their home districts. American guards handed out rations, canned peaches, powdered milk, and chocolate bars as farewell gifts. Photographs from that day show smiles forced through tears. Many of the women looked back at the empty barracks as the trucks rolled away, as if leaving behind not a prison but the last semblance of order they would ever know. For the Americans, it was a logistical success, another wartime duty completed. But for the prisoners, it marked the beginning of a psychological exile that would last decades. The wire had been both cage and cradle. Without it, they were adrift. When historians later traced their stories, they found an eerie pattern. Many of these women went on to work in post-war reconstruction, clerks, translators, and administrators in the very systems that rebuilt West Germany. Their efficiency, learned under the twin shadows of dictatorship and discipline, became the backbone of a recovering nation. They never spoke publicly of the camps. Yet those who knew them noticed the same habits: precision, quietness, and a love of schedules. The same order that had once been forced upon them now lived within them. The paradox was complete. Captivity had not broken them, it had preserved them. In the ruins of the Third Reich, they carried forward the one thing they had learned to trust: structure. And yet, in the spaces between their routines, a haunting truth remained. Freedom, when stripped of meaning, can terrify more than imprisonment. What happened to those women after they crossed the border? How they rebuilt their lives in a shattered nation, and what their silence would come to signify would reveal the deeper cost of victory itself. Because for them, the war had not ended when the guns fell quiet. It ended only when they learned to live without walls. When those women finally stepped beyond the fences, the world they entered no longer resembled the one they had been taught to serve. Germany in 1945 was not a country. It was a wound stretched across Europe. Cities like Cologne and Berlin lay silent under drifting clouds of soot. Rubble swallowed entire neighborhoods. Church spires leaned like broken fingers. In the West, the American and British occupation forces struggled to keep millions of refugees alive. In the East, the Red Army's shadow hung heavy with vengeance. For the women who had refused to leave the camps, freedom meant stepping into this abyss of ruin and shame. They carried with them no banners, no orders, no certainty, only the habits of captivity, punctuality, obedience, cleanliness, and composure. These, strangely, became their tools for survival. Many found that the structure learned behind barbed wire, the discipline of standing in line, of waiting, of doing what must be done, translated perfectly to a Germany desperate for stability. When the Allied Control Council began recruiting local civilians to assist with rebuilding infrastructure, translating, and filing denazification paperwork, former female POWs were among the first to volunteer. The Americans noticed their reliability. Their precision, shaped by military bureaucracy, helped transform chaos into administration. In small offices set up inside ruined schools, typewriters clacked again. Some of the same women who had recorded Luftwaffe orders now typed lists of displaced persons and ration cards. Others worked in hospitals, cleaning wounds that were no longer caused by bombs, but by starvation and disease. Their discipline turned to compassion, mechanical at first, then genuine. One nurse later wrote that it was strange to heal under the same flag that once frightened us. For the U.S. officers overseeing reconstruction, these women became invisible allies. They rarely complained and never demanded recognition. Their quiet endurance fitted perfectly into the rhythm of post-war recovery. The Marshall Plan had not yet begun, but its foundations, record-keeping, logistics, food distribution, rested on countless anonymous hands like theirs. Ironically, the efficiency of America's military captivity had trained the first civilian workforce of West Germany. Yet, beneath the order and rebuilding, a deeper transformation unfolded. In interviews conducted years later by sociologists, several of the women described the camps not as prisons, but as waiting rooms of identity. Inside the wire, stripped of propaganda and fear, they had time to think. For the first time, they had seen authority function without hatred. They had seen an enemy feed them without contempt and discipline them without humiliation. That quiet exposure altered their sense of what power could be. This realization became the silent seed of a new Germany. When these women raised families in the 1950s, they passed down values that reflected that dual experience: discipline without fanaticism, patriotism without blind loyalty. Their children grew up in homes where structure was sacred but ideology was suspect. Decades later, historians tracing post-war German social psychology would find echoes of American camp routines, tidiness, punctuality, procedural fairness, woven into the DNA of a democratic society. But for the women themselves, the peace was uneasy. In the Soviet zone, those with known military records were often interrogated or punished. A few disappeared into forced labor programs in Siberia, their fates erased. In the Western zones, they were met with suspicion rather than gratitude. Neighbors whispered. Employers asked uncomfortable questions. Some cut their hair short and changed their names. Others simply kept silent. In a society eager to forget, their memories became burdens best hidden. Those who had formed friendships with American guards carried a strange nostalgia. Decades later, when interviewed by journalists, a few smiled wistfully, describing the camp gardens, the evening songs, and the guards who shared chocolate bars through the wire. They called it a strange kind of peace. It wasn't affection for captors, it was longing for order. In the world outside, order had collapsed into moral grayness, black markets, corruption, and desperation. Behind the fences, even defeat had felt clean. The paradox of their story became clear as Germany rose from the rubble. The same women who once clung to captivity became builders of the new world. Their quiet competence formed the backbone of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. They worked in factories assembling radios and sewing machines, in schools teaching languages, and in offices balancing ledgers. They built with the same precision they once used to decode messages for war. Their success was built not on ideology, but on endurance in the 1960s and 70s. When filmmakers and journalists began to explore the hidden histories of World War II, their story was nearly forgotten. The archives recorded battles and generals, not clerks and typists, but a few researchers uncovered reports from the U.S. Army Psychological Division describing the phenomenon of voluntary captivity. The documents spoke of a population too traumatized by collapse to reintegrate. It was one of history's quietest rebellions, not against the enemy, but against the void left by defeat. The legacy of that rebellion rippled through time. In classrooms across post-war Germany, teachers, many of them former auxiliary women, emphasized responsibility and moral independence. They taught their students that authority must always be questioned and that order without conscience breeds destruction. Their lessons were not theoretical. They were lived experience, distilled from the memory of singing behind fences while the world outside fell apart. When historians interviewed them in old age, they spoke softly, almost apologetically. "We were afraid of freedom," one woman admitted, "because freedom meant we had to decide who we were without orders." Another added, "Inside, we were safe from our own country." These confessions stunned scholars. Yet they revealed a truth about the human condition far beyond the war, that the loss of certainty can wound more deeply than captivity itself. By the time the last of them passed away in the late 20th century, their story had become a footnote in military archives, an oddity, a psychological case study. But its lessons survived in quieter forms. Modern armies studying the psychology of surrender still reference the phenomenon of post-authoritarian paralysis, the state in which individuals conditioned by rigid hierarchies struggle to act without command. Their experience became part of the broader understanding of how societies recover from totalitarianism. In the end, the women who once stood behind American fences left behind no monuments, no medals, and no speeches. Their legacy was subtler, a nation rebuilt by those who had learned the hard way that order without conscience is emptiness, and freedom without purpose is despair. When asked near the end of her life what she remembered most, one of them simply said, "The day they opened the gates. We did not know whether to walk forward or turn back." That single hesitation, caught between the ruins of tyranny and the uncertainty of freedom, became a mirror for an entire generation. It showed that victory in war does not always mean victory in the soul, and that sometimes the truest battles begin only after the guns fall silent. And so history closes its final frame. Rows of young women standing behind wire in the pale light of 1945. Faces weary but calm, the gates before them wide open. The guards wait. The world waits. Yet they do not move. Because in that suspended moment, between captivity and choice, humanity itself stands revealed, trembling at the edge of freedom.